Will Durant once said, to say nothing, especially when speaking, is half of the art of diplomacy. Keep this in mind as we discuss today the recent trip of the United States Vice President to Singapore and Vietnam, and what does it mean for the future geopolitical landscape in that part of the world. My name is Dr. David Oualaalou.
And my name is Dr. Ross Stewart.
And you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
As we usually start off saying, thank you for watching and how important it is for you to subscribe. The more subscriptions that we have, the more our channel is promoted by YouTube and the more our message gets to more and more people worldwide. Thank you.
And also we wanted to thank our Patreon members for their continued support, and for you, if you like our videos and you want to demonstrate your support, consider joining our Patreon membership. Thank you all for your support.
The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, has just visited 2 Southeast Asian nations. And I know we're going to discuss them separately, but what's your overall take on what's the story here?
What's the story behind the story, right?
What's the story behind the story?
So, well, indeed, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, just completed a trip to Singapore and Vietnam. And usually you will think in terms of, it comes on the heels of what's taking place in Afghanistan. So that makes it very interesting as far as, is this trip's purpose to sort of save the credibility of the U.S.?
Good luck with that.
Or is it to stir up more trouble to contain China?
Maybe both.
Both. You're right. So it's very, there are a lot of conversation right now among geopolitical analysts that, what did the trip achieve? And many, or so many analyses point to the finger that nothing has been achieved into that.
As we watch the press conference of President Lee of Singapore and our Vice President, President Lee came off as a real statesman, really a caring human being who really attempted to impart genuine information. And our Vice President, it sounded hollow, like she had nothing to say. Like all the things that were supposedly accomplished had long ago been accomplished behind the scenes.
That's correct. But this one also, when you have to take a step back, and just for you to know the history between China and Singapore into the context of this visit, because that was the whole objective of the trip, is to shore up support from not only those countries, but other regional countries when it comes down to
the suppression of
China. Containment policy. Even though I do believe, and I don't know if you do or not, but I do believe personally that that containment policy is not going to succeed. It will not be the same way like we did to the Soviet Union back then. So
the dynamic is so different.
They are different. The geopolitical landscape is different.
And you take a look at all the nations in Southeast Asia, virtually all of them, have working relationships with China, and China is frequently their #1 trading partner.
That's correct.
So their economies are dependent on their relationship with China.
So in the case of Singapore, if you take a step back and you go back to the especially after the independence of Singapore in 1965, what took place after that one was that the former prime minister, I believe, I got his name here. So his name is, how do I pronounce that one? How do you pronounce that one?
Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew. So he was the former Singaporean president. So he disclosed, for example, how the relationship between China and Singapore was so close. And to the point that what's interesting is that Singapore, since its independence, it took about Singapore 3 decades to achieve an economic status to move from what it used to be called third world country to the first. And they achieved that in such a short time.
And did it with the full cooperation of China.
Yeah, and this is where China took the model of the Singaporean and apply it to China itself by, as a matter of fact, there is, and I'm going to quote a term here, by what would become known as socialism with the Chinese characteristics. So this one usually paved the way for, when you go back, at the time was the Vice President Deng Xiaoping, who became the leader, who exchanged visit with Singapore back in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. And in return, the Premier of Singapore visited China 33 times.
That tells you the importance of the relationship. And we also know that Singapore is primarily run by ethnic Chinese.
Exactly, because the interesting aspects of these, those leaders developed a relationship, and even the ones that comes after Deng Xiaoping's retirement, like for example, when former President Jiang Zemin, they still maintained that relationship with the Singaporean leaders. And this is why, and this is for you to know, that issues between Singapore and China, both countries feel they can always resolve those issues because of that old friendship.
It's also interesting looking at the behavior, that is the public behavior of the leadership in Singapore, and how calm they are, how non-judgmental they are, how reasonable they are, and how well they project the message of, we're here to do a good job, take care of our people, and do good business. And their honesty is world-renowned.
Yeah, that is correct. So there is also another factor that we like just to bring about Singapore before we move into talking about Vietnam, is that when it comes down to Singapore, you're going to have to think in terms of strategic location.
Oh, boy, do they have it.
Yeah.
The Malacca Strait?
The Malacca Strait.
But Got it, thank you.
Yeah, Malacca Strait. And also the technological advances that Singapore have achieved, which China is going to need. So, and this is what explains, for example, why China had to think in terms of, maybe we should consider another alternative to Malacca Strait, like Gwadar.
Oh boy.
So
Pakistan.
Yeah.
And opening up that as a major port
exactly.
for Chinese goods.
Yeah. Because what you need to know that about 80% of China's energy, for example, comes through those waters.
Really?
80% of China's oil consumption comes from those waters. So to China, they wanted to make sure they can secure access to water. And this is what makes, if you take a step back and think as to why the United States chose to go to Singapore, but not, let's say, Thailand or Philippines, or also because Singapore and the United States have an understanding as far as allowing U.S. military naval assets to be docked right there on the water in Singapore.
At least for now.
For now, how we say. Yeah.
Well, Singapore's kind of in an interesting situation in that they provide a lot of high-tech materials.
Indeed.
That are then assembled in China. And China has dedicated to producing those products themselves, which might leave Singapore in quite a vulnerable situation.
Yeah, well, that's why their relationship has moved over. I mean, over the decades, they've been, some sort of a good relationship. It was still about I don't remember the exact dates, when the Chinese had to confiscate some weapons coming out of Thailand on their way to Singapore, because Singapore does have ties with Taiwan.
Oh.
And we all know how the Chinese usually, the stand they take when it comes down to some other countries recognizing Taiwan as an independent, which is problematic to begin with, because we all know about the two system, one country, two systems. Yeah. So that was the point to this is that, is there a competition between the two countries? Are they friends? Are they foes? It's hard to tell at this point. But historically speaking, they go way back. And that in itself is what assists them to at least sit down and have a conversation.
You know, I can't imagine two nations that don't sometimes have different points of view,
Exactly.
don't have points of conflict.
Exactly.
And I think you really said it correctly in terms of sitting down and talking about it. Now, as we say over and over again, the Chinese are willing. They're tough negotiators.
That's correct.
So what?
And so is Singapore. They strike me as pragmatic, policymakers and officials that they will think of the strategic interest rather than tying themselves, especially after tying themselves to the U.S., especially after what just took place in Afghanistan. So they're going to be thinking in terms of what's in it for us.
As they should.
That is correct. So. And the second leg of the trip has to do with Vietnam, which is another interesting country, given the old history between Vietnam and China. Those they go way back, thousands of years. They share the culture, they share music, they share art, poems, and so forth. They do have some cultural similarity, shall we say, But for Vietnam, Vietnam has another advantage that other countries don't. And that advantage is an economic one. Vietnam is considered one of the major economic partners to China for the last 15 years.
The amount of export from Vietnam to China is astronomical. I mean, It's just shocking when you think 100 million people produce that much that goes to China. Because I think that's the population of Vietnam now. 100 to 110
Somewhere
million.
around that.
Yeah.
That's correct. To Vietnamese, the leaders, yes, they're going to give the proper reception for the U.S. representative and so forth. But as far as substance, I don't see them taking chance with, damaging that economic relationship with China. When you have your big neighbor growing that big economically, you're going to have to think twice about what's need to be done.
As we say over and over again, no matter what you think about it, everyone in the region must come to some accommodation with China, the way any country has to with a superpower.
That's correct. And this is not about China bullying them. You think in the case of South Korea, which we talked about. Moon Jae-in has to think in terms of what's good for his country, economically speaking, given that a lot of companies in South Korea depends on the Chinese market. Because we always say you cannot ignore that vast sheer size of the market in China. So, but if you take another example in the opposite direction, which will be Australia.
Oh, man.
So we all see what the outcome is.
The one sentence about Australia is, under one government set of leadership, great relationship, great trade, great profit. The next government comes on and it falls, it tanks.
Yeah. Well, actually, because the previous Australian government, just to mention this to you, for you to know, under Kevin Rudd, understood the importance of that relationship between China and Australia. He understood that. And actually, Australia was doing very well economically under his tenureship. The current administration under Morrison, we're not criticizing, I'm not an Australian guy, I'm not an Aussie, so.
And it's up to the Australians to
decide.
Yeah,
to decide. It's not us. We're just providing facts here. Morrison administrations didn't think in those long terms because they just end up having to follow what the United States was telling them to do. So, and that ended up impacting businesses in Australia and so forth. So South Korea, to go back to the South Korea part, they thought about it the same way when it comes down to China. And now, with this visit, Vietnam is thinking the same way. Yes, they're going to have to do the diplomatic protocol like with any other dignitary that visits.
Right.
But as far as substance of it, should we follow the United States blindly? I don't think so. Because they're going to have to think. They share close the waters in South China Sea and so forth. They're not going to want to jeopardize that. Yes, they do have differences with China, Vietnam and China, but they are willing to sit down and find a solution to that.
Well, they share a common border, and we know that there was a very short war between Vietnam and China, and the Chinese made a strategic fallback.
Fallback, that's correct. So it becomes the question now, Russ, it's for you as well, as to what is the geopolitical ramification of this trip? Did they have any geopolitical impact or not? And the short answer to that is no.
We certainly couldn't find any.
No, I couldn't. And
Nothing.
I didn't see any.
Well, we both did, independently, we did deep dives into all the information we could find, and we found nothing of substance came out of this meetings. And so it made us suspect, what's the real reason? Was it distraction? Was it a serious attempt?
Or a photo op.
Or a photo op? I mean, we just couldn't tell, but what we found is nothing of substance came out of it.
No, it's not. It's because, which it makes perfect sense to think pragmatically about where these two countries stand on the issues pertaining to the South China Sea, pertain to China issues, pertain to the tensions, economic that is, between the United States and China. They are thinking in terms of, we don't want to be caught in the middle.
And the Asian nations are so clear about, let us out of this bug tussle.
Yeah.
We don't want any part of the conflict. We don't want to have to declare one way or the other.
Another. Yeah. Well, ASEAN already signed that treaty back in 1971 of being independent. They don't want to be part of any. So they don't even want a nuclear technology there. They don't want anything within their countries. So to them now, with the United States policy of containment or thinking about containing China, which I believe it's not going to work, once again, because circumstances are different today from what they were back when we contained the Soviet Union. Back then the world was divided into two camps.
Right.
Today you have a different geopolitical landscape. You have the emergence of new alliances. You have the U.S. global leadership in decline, and it has been for the last decade or so. You get other countries that start to think in terms of, what's in it for me, economically speaking. And those two countries are no different.
Right.
No exception either. They're going to have to think, after those images coming out of Kabul, and given the recent bombing that just took place recently, they're going to be thinking twice about,
Yeah, if we line up with the United States, will the United States do anything to protect us or to come to our aid if we need it? Well, I think Afghanistan tells the story.
Yeah, and when you take, for example, some surveys that was conducted way back, they called it the ABS, the Asian Barometer Survey, especially in the case of Vietnam. It was conducted back in March 20 last year. What they found is about 50% of Vietnamese prefer China, to 14.6% prefer the U.S.
Oh, does that tell a story?
So that just tells you right there where things are. Yes, they do think about China, but they don't see China under positive light because of the tensions in South China Sea.
Yeah.
Just because there is that high percentage, it doesn't mean that they prefer China. They don't. But this is no different than when you look at the same approach if we are to compare it to Taiwan. It becomes generational, the older generation versus the young.
And from what we can tell, like in Taiwan, it's the young generation says, we want our freedom, we want... Mm-hmm. And the great leap forward was the young Chinese saying, we want our way. I mean, it just goes on and on. When we take a look at uprisings or demonstrations here, who does it in the United States? It's the young people.
Yeah, that's correct. So in Vietnam, I am sure the older generation, assuming some of them still alive, they didn't forget what took place in Vietnam. So, yes, can they be forgiven? I'm sure some of them do, some of them don't. It's a human nature, I can't speak to that.
I have to ask myself these questions fairly frequently. As you know, I've recently interviewed Vietnamese people that are of the age that in their childhood, they were in Vietnam and got to experience the horrors of that war. And amazingly, they don't hold a bad place in their heart for the Americans. And I say, and then it goes on and on. Do the Germans of today have a bad place for the Americans or the Japanese? And they don't seem to.
Yeah. No, thanks. I mean, people move on. How much grudges can you hold? You know, it will only drain you. It will only drain your own energy rather than, some people decide we better move on.
It certainly seems to be the rule, not the exception.
Exactly. So just to take this within the context of, okay, what this trip means overall, I couldn't find any sort of a solid argument as to its purpose.
Or its value.
Yeah, or its value. You're absolutely correct. So does it become just a loud noise or just window dressing, as we say? Possibly not.
Well, I think it tells the whole story about, instead of substance, they talked about the armored car.
That tells you right there.
The news is, how many layers of armor in a car?
Yeah, there were about 9 vehicles that the vice president motorcade had to include. And why do we need to know about 9?
Because nothing else was going on.
Yeah, so I mean, both countries, Singapore and Vietnam, displayed great respect for the United States vice president, that's the diplomatic protocol you're supposed to. But that does not mean we're going to bow to you and agree on whatever you say, because now their future, their well-being, economic and otherwise, and strategic for that matter, depends on what's taking place in that part of the world. And we all know if tensions erupt in the South China Sea, we all know where this is going to lead to. And China's going to react to that one way or another. I am convinced about this one, because China now is in a position that they can't be silent anymore.
Well, they will no longer be humiliated.
Yeah, that century is gone.
That century is gone. We'd like to thank you for watching, and we'd like to thank you for subscribing.
And as always, stay informed. Till next time. Bye-bye.